Hi, I'm Tasha Austin, host of Critical Conversations with NJTESOL-NJBE, where we counter anti-Black racism in language education, starting with ourselves. In this season 2, we invite experts to help push us forward in this goal. This month, we have Dr. Aris Clemons, Assistant Professor of Hispanic Linguistics in the Modern Foreign Languages and Literature Department at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Thanks for joining us. Now let's have a critical conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tasha Austin, and welcome back to Critical Conversations with NJTESOL-NJBE, where we counter anti-Black racism in language education, starting with ourselves. Welcome to season 2. We are so excited because as we've engaged in this work, we've kind of turned a corner. I won't say leveled up, but we turned a corner, right? Wherein we were digging inward and bringing in our executive board members to discuss their own journeys. And now that we've done about a year of work, we realize we need help, right? So we've come to a place where we've reflected and we've thought about, we've put some resources, we've done some thinking, we've done some studying, we've arranged some different policies within the organization, but we need some experts to come and support us because countering anti-Black racism in language education isn't a year-long journey, right? It's a forever work. I am ecstatic to have Dr. Aris Clemons with us. And I'm gonna allow for her to, one, introduce herself, but two, if I can just ask you, Dr. Clemons, to tell us a bit of how you came to your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. And I always like to introduce myself because I allow people to say my name in so many different ways. I thank my mother for giving me a kind of versatile name. So my family calls me Aris because they say it in English, but I often tell people that whatever language you met me in, just however your language says Paris, just lob that P off, and that's my name. So Aris is often what people call me because we often meet in Spanish, and this is the context of being a Spanish teacher often kind of frames how people see me. It took me a very long time to graduate from undergrad work because I spent a good amount of time as a communications major, and it wasn't until my junior year that I realized that it wasn't the business of communication that I was interested in, but rather the science of it. And still in realizing that and kind of asking questions, nobody ever said, well, there's this field called linguistics that you can like do this. And so then I just like switched to Spanish language philology, and I started studying like literature and culture and things like that. And so this very windy journey led me to finish my undergraduate studies in Madrid, Spain. And I didn't speak any Spanish. I was just like, I'm going to go for a couple months, see what I acquire, and then see if I can do this. And so I went, and I was pretty conversational within a couple months. And I was like, oh, I'm staying here. And when I did that, after, starting school at the University of Madrid, finishing, and then realizing that I still didn't feel like I was in a place where I could be successful and supported at home in the United States, I got a job at a bilingual school. And it wasn't until I was really researching the reasons why it was quite difficult for students to acquire English in this bilingual context beyond numbers and colors and greetings and all of the kinds of packaged language bits that we teach in language programs, that I Googled my way into linguistics. And I Googled my way into acquisition. And after a few years of working as a bilingual ed teacher, I was like, you know what, I think I should go to grad school and get a degree in linguistics and see what happens there. So that's kind of the windy path into how I got into this. Yeah.
Listen, I've heard windy path before, but you weren't kidding. Wow. Okay, let me just sit with for a moment the fact that it was easier for you financially to finish your education in Madrid than here. Whether we keep it or cut it, I need to know a little bit more.
So I would say that I'm from California. I'm from the Bay Area in California originally. And it costs a lot of money to live there. And when we use federal numbers to kind of indicate how much students are going to get, if they're going to get grants, if they're going to get Pell Grants, that meant that my parents made about $35 too much. They made about $35 over what was required to get for me to get grants, right?
Wow.
And so I didn't get any financial aid. And the kind of school that I went to didn't kind of prepare me to apply for scholarships in ways that would have been beneficial, because they weren't used to working with students with financial needs. So I went to a private school, and all of the students came from families where they could just pay for college. And so it wasn't part of their college prep programming to kind of teach us ways that even if we didn't meet the financial requirements of grants and aid, how would we get it? So it ended up being a situation where at a very young age, I thought that I was going to be a teacher. I loved teachers. I loved many of my educational experiences, even though some of them were quite violent.
Yeah.
So I thought that I was going to be a teacher. And so I had made the decision that I didn't want to take out loans, because I was like, teachers don't get paid that much. And how will I ever pay these loans back? Tell that to my loans right now, Biden. No. So that was when I realized, so when I was in the United States and I was going to school, I was just working. So I was a commuter student, and I would try to get all of my classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I would work all of the other days, including the weekend. And that was just like untenable. And so I had talked to somebody at the community college that I was going to, and they were like, well, there's this program in Spain and you can get resident credit here for some of the Cal states. And I was like, ooh, I can get resident. So I didn't go immediately, but I just explored it and figured out how I could max myself to a way where I could move over there and pay their local cost, which are like $500. And still then be able to transfer it to resident credit.
That is.
So technically I graduated from Cal State Fullerton.
But in reality,
I went to University of Madrid for a good amount of that.
That is wild. That is absolutely wild. It actually does help me kind of get to the place where I'm thinking about your response to Charity Hudley, which I imagine as the Beyonce of linguistics.
Mixed with the Lizzo.
I mean, I'm just saying. I know you're from the Bay Area, and it might have been proximity, but maybe not, right? Because her reach as a scholar is so vast. It really probably proximity might have played into it, but I wouldn't credit it totally. But I do know that, in reading your work, your piece where you're responding to, her call for, linguistics to essentially get it together, right? There's part of your work where you're saying, you and your co-author, you're really talking about that, you say there's not a particular band of wavelengths, but a particular societal position, and not just any subordinate non-white person, but a peculiar location within the nexus of multiple oppressions created by white supremacy. Like that is how you describe and define Blackness. And I think about that a lot with what you just told me about societal positions. And I also think about how you describe your scholarship as involving race making, which I think is a really important way to talk about what you study, right? Because many folks talk about race, but when you set it up as race making and you talk about contingent societal positions, I think that's very helpful, particularly for our organization who is hit two really points of tension and what we're hoping to do in countering anti-Black racism. And one has to do with thinking about this, we want more Black people, right? In our organization, in leadership. And then we have to really stop and say to ourselves, who's Black? I mean, it's right. Like we keep working from a premise that nobody's really clarified or normed. And so when I look at your work, I look at how there isn't a static way that you're engaging with these terms, which is so important. If we're going to do this work in a deep way, we may as well get the foundation right. And that's part of my excitement in speaking to you, because again, you challenge it in your work on the African-American Dominican boundary difference. And you're citing Kendi and you're citing Hartman and Wilderson and saying that Blackness is an organizing concept of American life, right? And so our goal to ensure that the voices of Black people are centered in all aspects of our organization, these ways that you're defining Blackness, like contingent and based on society position and all of that, how might that help us clarify what it looks like to center the voices of Black people, particularly as we're trying to tighten up and get a critical eye on our policies?
When I think about the ways that Blackness has been constructed, not necessarily by Black people, but that we have had to live the repercussions of this structure of Blackness, means that we have often acquired the mechanisms that are used to create boundaries around it, right? And so then we engage in the policing practices of race, of boundary creation, of categorization, of human categorization, right? And then we say, well, because we've suffered these oppressions, then we get to say who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so I often caution us to not get kind of bogged down by these structures of white supremacy, really, right? So it feels like Blackness is the juxtaposition to whiteness because it is. And so the only way that it exists in certain cases is by upholding the structures that white supremacy has created for us. And so I often think about this, like, Blackness, in order for it to work, it must be expansive, right? It's always changing. So I think about how I currently identify myself. I identify as Black, hard stop. I don't really find it useful to kind of locate myself along the continuum of Blackness, because I've made the political choice to kind of reclaim that which is used to subjugate us most at this point, and Blackness is really it. So when I think about what Blackness can do and how this categorization and kind of centering Blackness can do this work that so many Black feminists have taught us about bringing the kind of most marginalized identities, the most marginalized people to the center of our work, of our liberatory frames. I think about the fact that we can't really do this without a continual choice, making the continual choice to unlearn all that has defined life in post-colonial societies, right? And so there's this kind of thing of whiteness as a structure that kind of defines what's right, what's moral, what's clean, what's natural, what's neutral. And now that I'm kind of just rambling a bit, I think the answer to your question is, like, much like whiteness has been used to define the standard or the dominant, Blackness can be used to locate alternative modes of being. And these can be ones that are driven by community knowledge. And most importantly, these are ones that kind of privilege humanity, right? And so you mentioned many of the kind of Black scholars that I cite often, but one that wasn't mentioned that often helps me kind of shape my thinking about any of the liberatory or activism work that I do is Sylvia Wynter. And so, she locates the Black women in her concept of human, and her work is beautifully complex, so I won't necessarily go into it, but she kind of brings us to this idea of humanity and human as praxis. So what this means is that we have to center humanity as self-determination. We got to create policies and structures that kind of aid in allowing people to kind of define themselves for themselves, right? So these structures or these kind of policies that we create, they must allow for kind of iterative evaluations of who we're serving and why we're serving them and who they think they are. And they need to require some sort of accountability, right? So I think we often talk about intent and we often have the right missions and the right mission statements, but there has to be some sort of accountability for this intent to turn into action, right? So we need to be able to hold accountable those who are kind of pushing back or unwilling to unlearn the current structures to task, right? I think all of these ideas about how we center Black people and Black voices is about refusals to kind of exist within the standards or the modes that have been given to us. Right. So we get to be creative. We get to rely on artists. We get to do all kinds of things.
I'm all of that is so powerful and important because, first of all, it makes me relax into a comfortable space of knowing that that's why there's not an endpoint to this work. Because if it's about refusals and if it's about relocating a sense of sovereignty to the folks that we claim we want to center, then how can you put a timeline on it? It's got to be about stepping back, right? And the levels that you shared is like, it's not just about who's quote Black or who's not Black per se, but rather like how they're experiencing their own worlds. Like for some folks, depending on where they are within a structured system, they might see themselves differently than how we see them maybe from empire, right? Being like in the United States or from maybe even a middle class standard. Like it might look very different, and that requires a patience, and that requires us to push back and decenter, even as people who are like, I am a Black person, I'm a Black woman. It doesn't mean I have the end all be all knowledge to how every Black person experiences their reality. So I just
to understand it, right? Like, and we often are in this position where we're like, listen, if we tell you that we've experienced these moments of oppression, then believe us. But then we also engage in not believing people when they're telling us about who they are, right? How do we lean into our fears? And so that we can be more responsive to humanity.
What I'm really excited about hearing from you about leaning into the fear is, firstly, if you don't mind if I ask, I'm African-American. Is your background Dominican? Is it African-American? There's a reason I'm asking this, I promise.
I'm not, I consider myself African-American and Afro-Caribbean. So my dad his family is from the United States. And then my mom's family is from the Caribbean, from Martinique. And so, but she came here when she was very young. And so I was raised in African-American frames. And my parents were very intentional in my Blackness, and I was sent to an African-American Montessori school for preschool, where literally everything was taught through the frames of Afro diasporic content. If we learned about numbers, we learned it through Kemet in Egypt. If we learned about kings and queens and all of this kind of really generative, positive formation around Blackness as a child, that meant that when they did send me to primarily white institutions, which happened, right? Nobody could tell me anything. I was like, I went to a Catholic school. We had to paint Jesus. Jesus was getting painted Black. You know what I mean? Because I already had this formation and nobody could tell me anything. So when kids challenged that, I was like, this is your white Jesus and this is my Black Jesus and we're good.
That's all. And my excitement is because I'm thinking about the piece that, I think it was the New Blacks piece. I might be wrong, but it was the one where you cite Cardi B. And I love it.
Cardi B.
Listen, love upon love, there's levels to it, right? But, you know, when we're talking about this complexity and this refusal and this expansive Blackness, it's one of the reasons why I love it so much. And that's why I went so far as to say, now, how do you self-identify? Is because a lot of the places that I find the most tension is in this like intra-communicative kind of like, who are we? As opposed to like, who do folks think we are? And I'm thinking about that piece, and you bring up her frustration at the general lack of understanding between just basic terms that get thrown around a lot: ethnicity, race, nationality. And so our goals as an organization, you know, like I said, we want to recruit and mentor more board members that are committed to countering anti-Black racism, but who also reflect the cultural and linguistic diversity of the populations we serve. Now, the organization being based in Jersey, what often happens is when we talk about bilingualism and if we talk about ESL populations, what mostly conjures in people's minds is folks of Asian descent and folks of Latinx descent, but in their minds, they're not conjuring images of Black people.
Right.
They're just not, right?
Which is interesting because there's the sheer number of Black immigrants in that space is
This is it. This is it. And
Indicative
so
of
when you bring up her frustration and folks trying to, again, like minimize her Blackness, you're this or you're that. Are you Dominican, or are you Black? Are you this? Are you that? And she's just like, wait, what? Like, why are you trying to put me in these categories, right? So for us as an organization, we can say, again, it's about these terms and making sure we know what we mean by them. We can say we want to ensure that we have more Black folks on the board and that we want to be able to have them reflect the cultural and linguistic diversity of the populations here. But how do we frame and unpack cultural and linguistic diversity as it relates to Blackness?
So I think you guys are already doing a little bit of this work, because when you introduced me, you talked about this kind of Dr. April Baker Bell's, anti-Black linguistic racism, the frame of anti-Black linguistic racism. And so I often move from this frame, but one of the frames or ideas that I've adapted and kind of incorporated into my own thinking about this comes from a sociologist named Dr. Nancy Lopez. And she's at UNM, I believe, at the University of New Mexico. And she's a sociologist. And she kind of came to this, and really for methodological reasons, came to this concept of street race. She calls it street race. And street race alongside anti-Black linguistic racism is the ways that I've really been thinking about this. So first, let me just really quickly explain what street race is, just in case anybody doesn't know what it is. And why she did this methodologically is because she decided that just allowing people to self-identify didn't necessarily capture the nuances of whatever race, especially Blackness, as it was being thought of. So she said, look, street race is this idea that if you closed your mouth and walked out onto the street and didn't have any language or any other kind of cultural identifiers, what would somebody else think you were? What census box would they mark for you, basically? And that is really thinking about the ways that some of us are not able to escape the social locations, the racial locations that have been defined by our society, right? Because when we walk on the street, we don't get to, there's no ambiguity about it. We kind of live within this space. So it didn't matter. Let's say, for example, I wasn't, but let's say, for example, I was raised by a white family in a completely white community, and I really culturally kind of identified with white people because that was what I had. The fact that my skin color has been linked to Blackness in ways that doesn't allow for it to be delinked means that it would be impossible for me to move through the world without being Black, right? And all of the kinds of consequences that go with that. So when I think about that, alongside the fact that I still have privileges, that I can use my language, that I can use my socioeconomic status or my level of education to move into circles that many of my Black counterparts may not be able to move into, then when we're thinking about who we should be serving or who we should be thinking about, it's like, who are the people that are impacted, who are not able to kind of escape their conditions of marginalization, in ways that means that they are the ones that are consistently being impacted by these violences and erasures and persecution that Dr. April Baker Bell talks about in terms of this anti-Black linguistic racism, right? And so when thinking about that and thinking about what are the ways that we redress this harm, that is the linguistic justice that Dr. and Charity Hudley is talking about, that we're all talking about. Like, how do we get to this moment of linguistic justice for Black language users who are consistently being impacted by this anti-Black linguistic racism? And I think that we create policies that speak directly to the most marginalized. We bring them to the center. You know, I'm probably gonna keep on saying it because that's that like Black feminist praxis of bringing the most marginalized to the center. And so we have conversations, right? We present reports and policies that show that though Afro-descendant population in the United States is about at 13%, and we can talk about why it's kind of maintained that number over hundreds of years. That's a whole nother conversation. But then presenting that number is at about 30% in Latin America. And so why are we not recruiting Black Spanish language teachers in bilingual education context, right? What are the actual reasons why we're not doing that? And then our policies should talk directly to that, right? And it should talk to the experiences of people who have suffered linguistic insecurities because of their location within their Black bodies and their linguistic practices, right? So I'm thinking about the fact that when I'm doing a lot of my research, I do a lot of memory studies with Afro-Latinos and their experiences in Spanish language courses, where they've been told that their language was street language or slang or things like that. And then kind of removed from the possibility of certifying themselves in ways that makes them viable candidates for the work, right, of being a language teacher, of being an educator, even though they're experts in this, right, language and culture. And so I really, really think that your organization is incredibly primed to do the work of kind of speaking to these populations that sit at the margins of our categorization practices. How are we categorizing, right? What classificatory practices are we engaging in? And then who's sitting at the margins of those?
Wow. My notes over here are out of control. I just, because there's just some kernels of truth that you can just sit in for a really long time moving forward. Because the fact of the matter is, I'm not now, we've made some progress. I was the only Black member of our executive board, and now we have another, and I'm grateful for that. But the expansive Blackness that you talked about really gets elevated when you bring in that element of Nancy Lopez's work of the street race, because that is such helpful language to, like, let's stop playing around, let's talk about who we're talking about. And it's hard sometimes to get to the heart of the matter when we have, acronyms like BIPOC, and I've had like a recent epiphany with that. And it's not because I don't know where it came from or why it's helpful, or third world women, and then people of color, women of color. Like I get that genealogy, but I'm thinking about DeAndre, miles-hercules, and just how eloquently they really spoke to, but is it helpful? Right? Like we just have to deal with it in the now and in the space. Who are we talking about, and how do we say it with specificity? And that street race concept is so helpful, because then we can stop mincing words when we say we want to center Black voices, and we want to ensure that the folks reflect the linguistic and cultural diversity of the students with whom we're working, because what we end up doing is recreating the hierarchies that we've been offered. Right. So then we can say, ticked that box, and you look up, it's still a sea of white faces.
And we can also really acknowledge what happens within our own communities, right? Whose Black voices are getting elevated. What do they look like? Are white people comfortable with them? What, all of these kinds of things that we don't want to talk about within these spaces, because we don't want to make it seem like the family's not doing well, right? We want to be like, okay, all is well at the cookout over here.
Not in front of the company.
Not in front of the company, right? But thinking through these concepts allows us to kind of to talk to those issues, right? If we think about who's been allowed leadership positions even within our own communities, what do they look like? How do they experience the world in multiple spaces that's allowed them the privilege to kind of move beyond, right? And so that we can move beyond these ideologies of exceptionalism and, a model behavior, because all of that is like, yes, the structures are right. I can just move beyond it, right? Like I can just attend to it, which they've never worked, right? And really, I think that one of the things that I wanted to say in terms of this whole conversation is I'm really interested in the ways that language allows, it shifts towards society, right? So language will forever shift towards the maintenance of the current power structure if we allow it to.
We began with this framework that looks like 3 concentric circles. And I'm very serious about, I don't put my hand to things that my heart is not in. And the reason that I was hoping to offer that framework is because I don't think we can look at this ever on one level. And what you're allowing for my brain to do as we move into year 2 of this process with this organization is to see that it's almost like a lung, right? We're going in and out and back and forth from the self to the society to the organization, back out, back in. And that's very helpful, because when you bring it down, when you boil it down to this point, is like, it's almost like a gravity that whiteness has, that it keeps trying to pull you back to maintain the status quo as it is. And that language will help you see that pull, because you're saying that the language is gonna keep pulling back to whatever the norm has been set as. That is so helpful.
And it helps us also be forgiving and to ourselves and to other people in our communities, because we're not immune to acquiring these dominant and hegemonic ideologies, right? Even when they're harmful to ourselves or our communities, right? And so the fact that we're not immune to them means that it's very easy that we can then use them in our communities to reconstruct. And this is how we get to ideologies of exceptionalism. This is how we get to these overlapping and intervening ideologies that white people can say, well, we didn't, create that.
Right.
But surviving white supremacy has meant that we kind of come to these different modes of survival. Another thing, when I was thinking about kind of expanding our notions of Blackness, really when people are having these kind of conflicts about who's Black and who's not Black, and self-hate, the complexity of self-hate and what it is, it's really our unwillingness to understand that there's different cultural modes for responding to white supremacy. So the ways that AfricanAmericans have been allowed to or have decided to respond to white supremacy may be very different than the way that a West African in the United States does, or the way that a Dominican in the United States does, or back in their colonial societies as well, or post-colonial societies as well. And so it's not that, an identification is a way to respond to white supremacy. And so that means that we may identify differently because we're responding to these structures, right? And so I think that learning, being in a constant state of learning, and privileging multiple voices, moving away from cult figures as all-knowing. I think these are all ways that we can move to more equitable organizations. And
it's hard. Like, imagine if you're the only Black board member, how do you represent the expansiveness of Blackness in your oneness, right? Like, I'm not trying to be untrue to myself, right? Because I'm someone who lived in Spain, learned Spanish in Spain, but the folks that I communicated with in Spanish in the US were never Spaniards. So the way that I, as Ujuanya would say, like, speak Blackness is very Caribbean, like it's very Puerto Rican, very Dominican, like, and so all of that level of complexity, it allows for me to suggest the multiplicity of Blackness within an organization, but it just reinforces how important it is to actually have a multitude of Black representation within the organization, because I shouldn't be put in a place to speak for Black Puerto Ricans, to speak for Black Mexicans, I shouldn't have to do that, right? Because they should be here, particularly.
And they exist, right? Like
they're real. Oh my God.
I'm not their godmother. That's just weird. Like,
I can't. Oh, I appreciate you so much. Oh my gosh.
This is very, very true.
So I'm gonna end with this, and not because I couldn't talk to you for another hour, but because I respect your time. I know you are cranking them out and helping to give folks like me something to build upon, because I have so many folks that I really rely upon their work, or I wouldn't have a place to start in this work. You're reaching and pulling for things, and it sounds like you are similar to what I do, because I'm constantly reaching into other disciplines, because within my own quote field, the void is loud, right? It's the loudest void ever. So, I'm thinking about all that you've offered so far in this episode, and I'm curious more about now that process, right? Like the racialization process. And I feel like you speak to that. Again, going back to the New Black's work, you're drawing from Flores and Rosa's work on raciolinguistic ideologies, and you talk about raciolinguistic enregisterment, right? Which, you know, now that you've given me some language, Nancy Lopez's work on street race, it's helpful too. But it refers to the process whereby distinct forms of linguistic practices become racialized. And I did some digging on that, and I know that that's pulling from Black feminist work as well. And so
that's why they're my favorites.
I mean, come on now. I'm all about that. Let's be clear. If we know where it's coming from, then we can do the deeper work, right? But then you use that in thinking about your examinations of these world language mission statements. And that's very appropriate for our organization, because we began this work during Black Summer with the murder of George Floyd and our own statement that we put out. So this for me is really important to dig into just a bit. You observe this converse racialization, that Mena and Garcia work, of minoritized Spanish speakers being devalued in their language practices compared to their Anglo peers. So we're literally talking about the same language practices being produced out of different bodies and being totally separately, hierarchically evaluated, right?
Yeah.
And so our organization focuses on ESL and bilingual ed. So what, if any, just fundamental understandings of language racialization do we have to engage to even attempt to counter anti-Black racism? Yeah,
there are so many fun. This question I could probably speak about, but one of the things I'm going to start with is I think we know. I think we are inundated with it in real ways that we need to just pay attention to. And so, as you know, I spend a good amount of my time kind of on the internet and analyzing internet discourse and things like that. And so just today I was watching, I don't know, a reel or a TikTok or something like that, where a woman was saying, I'm going to teach my deaf brother Gen Z words. Right. And in these Gen Z words, they were things like period, or
okay, see where we're going.
Other kinds of African-American Black language, right? That has kind of been co-opted into this idea of internet language or, youth language or things like that, without actually being attributed to certain populations and certain populations who are kind of punished when it does come out of their own mouth, but venerated when it comes out of other people's mouth. And so at the same time I saw that, I was also thinking of this internet trend where people question baseline assumptions about language. So in this series, it'll be somebody and they'll ask a question. They'll say, is this man really cute, or does he have green eyes? Right? Like, am I colonized, right? Is this a cogent and coherent argument, or is it just presented in standard English? Right? These are the kinds of questions that we need to constantly be asking ourselves when we're thinking about language and the way that we perceive it, right? And so in any work that we're dealing with language racializations, there are a couple of things. One, it's impossible to separate language from the body it is produced from. I think about this at the intersections of race. I think about this at the intersections of ability, right? In the ways that we, I'm even thinking about sign language and these other kind of aspects of language that often get pushed to the sides when we have these conversations about race. So there's race. Language is an embodied experience, and because it is an embodied experience, it cannot be separated from ideology, and then it cannot be separated from some sort of stance towards that ideology, and that's where our work lies. What stances are we taking towards particular ideologies? How are we communicating those stances, and how are we combating stances that we feel are harmful towards people?
I feel like we owe you a consultancy fee. I'm sorry, this is ridiculous. This is
I do have a consulting firm. We can talk about that later.
That's a separate call.
Yeah.
No, this is so important because there's just some foundational, and that was the whole orientation of inviting you, because of course we could talk about a million things, particularly in your pedagogies, because you do this thing, right? Like you research, but you do this thing, you teach. But there's just some foundational understandings that we've got to have. We can't just keep using, right? It could sound cogent, but is it really cogent, right? So we have to agree on what is Blackness, what is language, the fact that ideology you can't assume, right? And there's work out there within the realm of teacher education, like there's a Chang Bacon piece on even without working towards disrupting or enforcing language ideologies, it didn't matter. You impacted the language ideologies because you not, right? So the work is there, but we have to accept those as fundamental truths, or it doesn't matter the words that we're throwing around, because then
we could create whole new categories. They just get taken up in order to do the same work, right?
And we've watched it happen already
over and over and over and over again. Right? This is why I'm going to incorporate you into this. We don't feel comfortable with the term BIPOC.
No.
This is why we don't feel comfortable with it, right? Because it's very, and this is it, and I, I work on Latinidad a lot, and I think about these kind of movements, these hashtag movements to cancel Latinidad coming often from Black Latinos themselves, being like, no, this, right, this term, or even thinking about the term Latinx, and people saying like, no, nobody wants to use that term. But then the people who are like, well, yes, this was developed for a particular reason, and then it gets co-opted. There's no end state. There's no end game, right? I remember when the term woke came out, before people used it for a whole nother reason, because, post 2016. But I remember feeling like, no, we're not done. We're never done. We can't just wake up and be like, got it, I understand, right? And so it doesn't matter. The only thing that works is if you are consistently in a state of change. Octavia Butler talks about this, right? She says, all that you change changes you. The only constant truth is change, right? And so whatever you're doing, whatever policy you're doing, if you think that policy is just going to stick and then fix things and then we're going to be done, you're going to have issues. It's going to be a problem, right? So unless you're building your systems to be iterative in their evaluation of how they're treating people, right, then we're not going to get anywhere, and we're not going to have any progress, right? Like,
that's wonderful. This has been, I'm just sitting here for the rest of the afternoon and just let it all percolate. This has been so helpful and good and fulfilling. And I'm just grateful to just be in a space with you to just all facts right now. Because at the end of the day, and I was going to ask you another question, but I didn't need to because you did it naturally. I was going to ask you another question about how making sure these conversations honestly, like, just don't cater to the white gaze. Like, it was important for me to open up the floor, because I want everyone involved with our organization to be able to begin this walk. But if we say we want Black folks to come on board, our conversations can't center whiteness, because nobody wants to have those conversations, right? So I didn't even have to ask you to do that, because you do that. So I appreciate that.
And I will take a second to talk to white people, because I need them to know that this is their work, right? That their work as the stage of unlearning that white people have to engage in is different from the stage that of unlearning that Black people or people of color who embody and live these kinds of systems have to do, which means Black folks don't want to sit in a training meeting about diversity. We live it all the time. And that means that it requiring your whole staff to sit in racial trainings is actually not equitable at all, but rather triggering and violent, right? And so these are the kinds of things really thinking about when we say that this work is work of white folks. Dismantling white supremacy is white work, right? And so how are you going to attend to that on a daily basis in ways that, again, center people that aren't you?
And there you have it.
Mhm.
And there you have it. I so appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, and femmes and siblings, Dr. Clemons set us straight.
Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Tasha Austin, and we'll see you next time.